Hello everyone, I'm Kirsten Amanda, and for today's tutorial we're going to be painting this beautiful dried flower bouquet. So getting started with some supplies here, I have my watercolor paper. This is actually a handmade paper, but any watercolor paper will work. And then I have my palette here, and I will link all of the colors I use in this video down below. I have a cup of clean water over here, and then for my brushes, I will be using these Holbein gold round brushes in a size 8 and a size 6, but feel free to use any brush that you feel comfortable with. And up here, I have my reusable towel for blotting my water and paint from my brushes as I go, and then I also have a paper towel that I keep off to the side just for blotting and correcting any mistakes. I have my pencil and eraser over here as well, though we won't be doing much sketching at all to create this bouquet, just getting the placement of the flowers mapped out. I want to make sure the flowers are all centered on the page and that we have room for all the flowers we're going to paint, so I'm just drawing these circles really lightly with pencil where I want them to be. My apologies if you can't see this too well, but it gives an idea of where you're going to want your flowers. Starting with my smaller brush, I'm grabbing some raw umber and mixing it with indigo just to bring it a bit more to the cool side. Now with about a 50-50 ratio of water and paint, I'm going to start dropping in color on the center of this rose up here. I'm creating those C curves that are all wrapping fairly tight around each other, just making sure that they all look different from one another, varying the length and width of each shape. As we make our way from the center of the flower, I've added a touch more water to the mixture, and I'm starting to push my brush down a little bit harder, making larger petals. Again, I'm varying the size at this stage to make the flower look more natural. The trick with these petals is to wrap them around one another, making sure not to leave too much white space. Then once again, I'm adding more water to the mixture and making the next round of petals a little bit bigger. Before the inside of this flower dries, I'm going back to our first mixture that had the more concentrated, darker color in it, and I'm dropping it into the spots we painted that are still wet. The center of a rose is typically the darkest or most shadowed, so we want to make sure we have a darker value towards the inside and a lighter value towards the outside. I've rinsed out my brush now, and I'm using a very watery mixture of this color to create these larger petals, again just tucking them around one another. I'm going to drop some darker paint into those wet petals again, not too much as we did towards the center, but just enough to get some nice blooms going here. Now for the second rose, we're going to add some alizarin crimson or any pink color to the same mixture we already have going, and do the exact same thing for this rose over here to the right. The only difference to this rose is that it's facing towards the right, which means we're going to want to start the center of our rose towards the right of this circle that we drew. Make sure that you don't add any petals outside of the circle that you drew on the right. This is what's going to make it look like it's facing away. So as I said, I'm just going to go ahead and do the exact same process for this pink rose on the right as I did for the first rose on the left. Now I'm adding quite a bit of indigo to the mixture we already have going on our palette, and I'm just trying my best to not waste any paint here. I have my paper towel on hand for this white flower, and I'm going to start by drawing a large C curve below these two roses to make it look like this flower is tucked behind the roses. I'm just dropping in some color to the back of this petal, and now for these front petals, I'm going to start mapping them in to make sure I leave some white space. I'm also drawing a half circle here to show where my stamen is going to be, making sure all the petals I paint are coming from that point. I would recommend to use more water than paint for this flower, as we don't want a gray flower, we want to give the illusion that it's white. If you go too dark with your paint, you can always blot the wet paint with your paper towel. So as you can see, that flower is facing down, and then for our second flower, we want it to face forward, so all the petals will look the same. I mapped out where the stamen will be again, and I'm using my paint to outline the petals first and filling them in after making sure to leave some white space. Now before these dry, I'm just going to drop in some darker color in a few random spots on the flowers to give some beautiful color variation. Now, while our flowers are still wet, I'm taking some yellow ochre with a very small amount of water and dropping that into the center of these flowers, just kind of dotting it in. Now I'm going to use the exact same technique that I just showed you on this flower over here on the right. Okay, so let's start filling in some flowers over here on the left of the page. I'm taking a bunch of water in my brush and mixing some alizarin crimson in with the indigo and raw umber to create this very soft pink color. I'm very loosely just dropping in this color in random spots, making these thumbprint looking shapes by pushing my brush down onto the paper and then dropping the darker value of paint in some of these, but not all of them. We want there to be a variety of color value here. I'll draw the stems to these flowers later on. Now I'm going to paint another flower on top of these roses up here, so I'm taking my Vandyke brown with a touch of indigo, making sure that there's a lot of paint in this mixture and not a lot of water. I'm dropping this very concentrated color to make the stamen of the flower first, and then I'm rinsing out my brush completely and using the water in the brush, creating the petal shapes coming from the center. I'm letting the wet paint from the center bleed into these petals. While the paint is still wet and after the flower is carved out, I'm just grabbing some raw umber in my brush and dropping it in a few random spots just to add some interest. We're now going to start filling out the flowers towards the bottom right, so I'm getting a mixture of just raw umber and then another mixture of just Vandyke brown ready on my palette. Starting with the raw umber, I'm creating these little flowers poking out from behind the larger flowers here. Then I'm dropping in some Vandyke brown to the center stamen, letting the color bleed into the flower, and I'm also dropping in some of this color to a few random spots on the petals. These do not need to be perfect by any means. Some of my flowers have 4 petals, others have 5, and they're all facing different directions. We want this to look really whimsical and loose. Okay, so now that we have the center of the composition done, we're going to start working at adding some leaves and foliage. I'm taking Vandyke brown and painting in 2 larger leaves coming out of this flower. The key here is to be really loose and wiggly with your brush, as these leaves are dried and probably broken in some places. Then I'm dropping in some darker color while it's still wet. Now I'm going to add some smaller leaves over here, so I'm taking a very watery mixture of raw umber and I'm going to draw in these squiggly lines as the stem, and then I'm just painting some random shapes that look like leaves but aren't too perfect. Again, this painting is a dried bouquet, so everything can look sort of broken and imperfect. We're using our wet on wet technique again here, just to drop in some color and add some darker color value to these leaves. Now we're going to take a mix of Vandyke brown and indigo and really water it down, and use this to start mapping out the lines for the stem of these leaves with the watery mixture. I'm going to create these rounded leaves, dropping in darker color as I go. Remember, if you add too much color, you can either use paper towel to blot it, or you can pick it up with your brush. The shapes of these should be really imperfect circles to give that natural dried look. Once the leaves are done, I dropped in the darker color to the stem in a few spots and also drew more connecting stems. Again, these are very squiggly lines and they're very imperfect. Moving down to the bottom of the painting, I'm going to do the same leaves in this area of white space. I'm using the exact same technique, except at the end I ended up dropping in a brown color that I had on my palette just to give some extra color variation. Now I'm taking a pure mixture of Vandyke brown, which is a bit warmer of a brown than we've used so far, and I'm going to come on top of these yellow leaves and just add another layer of leaves on top to make it look like there are a couple of stems coming out of this bouquet. Again, this is very random, and I have these sort of lost and found lines as the stems. I also dropped in a little bit more color here just to add some interest. While I have this color on my brush, I'm going to use it to darken the stamen of this top flower and also carve out some of the petals a little bit better. So for the first time in this tutorial, I'm using a wet on dry technique to drop some darker color into the side of one petal where it would be shadowed, and then getting my other brush damp with clean water and using the end of it to smooth out the paint. As you can see, this really makes the flower pop, and it helps to also show where the flower ends and the page starts. Now again, using that Vandyke brown color, I'm starting to draw in the stems from these pink flowers towards the bouquet. These are really imperfect dashes of color, and the line thickness is varied from stem to stem. Don't overthink this process too much. I'm now taking a mix of Vandyke brown and indigo to draw this larger pampas leaf above our upper rows, making sure the edges look very wispy to give that crinkled effect. I'm starting to fill in the pampas leaf with a light layer of this color to start. While that's drying, I'm moving over to the top section of the bouquet and using the same technique I did on the bottom, painting in some really imperfect leaves using raw umber and then dropping in some darker color. I feel like the bottom needed a little something extra, so I'm taking that Vandyke brown and indigo mixture to add some branches coming out of the bouquet. Again, I'm just making sure to keep this really imperfect. Using the same color already on my brush, I'm drawing in the stems to these flowers over here on the right, and I'm also using this opportunity to darken some of my stamen to really make these flowers pop. Now I'm just coming over and grabbing some raw umber, and I'm filling in the stamen of these white flowers to give a bit more depth to them, just dotting in the color and not covering the whole center. I'm using the same wet on dry technique here that we did on the top flower, where I'm just taking more of that gray color and dropping it onto the petals to define them and add a shadow to them so you can really see each individual petal. Coming back over to the pampas leaf, I'm grabbing the same mixture we used before with a little bit less water and starting to draw these lines that go from the center to the outside and make these crinkle shapes that the leaves have. While it's still wet, I'm dropping in a bit more color in a few spots to really define the lines. I felt like this top flower needed something extra, so I'm painting these leaves coming out from on top of it. I'm using a mixture of raw umber and Vandyke brown for this and making sure they look really broken and dried. Now, using a mixture of indigo and Vandyke brown, I'm adding that second layer of leaves on top of the first layer. The more random you can be with the placement of these and the shapes of the leaves, the better. Over on the right, I'm using the same color to add more of those branches that I added at the bottom. Now for the fun part, I'm mixing sap green with my Vandyke brown and indigo mixture to give a really nice dark green color. I'm taking this and filling in all of the white space between the flowers with a bit of foliage. I'm being very random and quick with these movements as to not have it looking too perfect. You can drop this color in wherever you feel needs it, and then the painting is complete. Thank you so much for following along today, and I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to see more tutorials from me, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment down below what tutorial you want to see next. I'll see you in my next video.